Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the conference organized by the Department of Theology on the topic Accountability, Healing, and Trust, Conversations in Theology, Psychology, and Law for the Life of the Church. We welcome those who have traveled here to gather with us on campus and those who've gathered virtually to join this conversation. My co-convener, Professor Kim Belcher, and I are grateful for your willingness to be with us today and over the next 2 days to share insight from research and ministerial experience and to discuss these important topics. This conference is sponsored by the Notre Dame Office of Research, the College of Arts and Letters Institute for Scholarship and the Liberal Arts, the McGrath Institute for Church Life, Notre Dame Campus Ministry, the Liturgical Press, and our home Department of Theology, among others. We thank these groups for their support of this effort. We also thank Amber Kirk and Kaylee Wolf from University Events and Kate Gary and Heidi Henke from the College of Arts and Letters Communications Office, whose work has allowed ideas for a conference to become the reality of a conference. I would also like to add a word of personal thanks to my colleagues in the Theology Department, especially our chair, Tim Matavina, our department administrator, Melody Kessler, our conference panel conveners, Stacy and Josh Noem, Susan and Jeff Fethergill, Sister Mary Catherine Hilkert, John Fitzgerald, Lindsay Barrett, and Brian Boyd, and also the members of the Holy Cross community at Notre Dame, especially Father Mike Connors, for their constant encouragement for us to bring this conference to you. Of course, my greatest thanks go to my co-convener, Kim Belcher, who, in addition to working together with me on every aspect of the conference, organized all of the liturgies for this conference. So thank you, Kim, and Kim will be giving some remarks on our liturgies for the next few days in a minute or two. So 3 things I'd like to mention by way of introduction. A little bit of the background on how this conference came to be, a little bit on the aims of the conference, and then a few words on logistics. 3 years ago this month, March 2019, Notre Dame President Reverend John Jenkins announced that the President's Office would fund a series of research projects that address, quote, issues emerging from the church sexual abuse crisis. In April 2019, at the urging of our chair, Tim Matavina, faculty and graduate students in the Department of Theology gathered to discuss the abuse crisis and to discern the various ways that the department might respond to this and other initiatives that Father Jenkins' office had begun. At the conclusion of that meeting, several faculty and graduate students volunteered to serve on a department committee that formulated a grant proposal in conversation with members of other departments and with psychology and law professionals in the community. Kim Belcher and I served on that committee, as did Anselma Dolces Ashley, Jean Porter from the Theology Department, Susan St. Ville from the Keough School of Global Affairs, Kristen Valentino from the Department of Psychology, John Robinson and John Maciasek from the law school, Susan Fethergill of Fethergill and Associates in Mishawaka, and Amanda Zelichowski from Purdue University. That grant proposal received funding through the Office of Research program and was later supported by another grant from the College of Arts and Letters. After a number of delays due in part to the pandemic, the work of that committee, in collaboration with a number of individuals and units from across the university, yielded the conference upon which we're about to embark. Thanks to all who had a hand in formulating the initial proposal and those who helped refine it over the past few years. I want to note that this conference is only one of several initiatives supported by the President's Office through the Office of Research Grant Program. Other initiatives that earn grants provide us with an encouraging expression of the promising paths for research undertaken by our colleagues at Notre Dame. Just to give you a sample, these are some of the projects that were funded through the Office of Research that yielded conferences or ongoing research project. Mark Dorier's Passion of the Innocents, engaging the church sexual abuse crisis through a new musical setting of the Passion. Amanda McKendry, Responsiveness, Reconciliation, and Renewal, Crisis Leadership in Clergy Sexual Abuse. Kathleen Cummings, Gender, Sex, and Power, Toward a History of Clergy Sex Abuse in the U.S. Catholic Church. Richard Garnett, Consequences of the Sexual Abuse Crisis, Related Legal Issues and Policy Changes. Dan Hungerman, The Abuse Crisis and Social Well-Being, an Investigation of Deaths of Despair. Katie LeSean, The Impact of the Church Sexual Abuse Crisis on Parish Life and Catholic Education, Pastoral Responses and Recommendations for Practice. Daniel Philpott, The Truth Will Make You Free, Do National Truth Commissions Hold Promise for the Catholic Church's Response to the Sexual Abuse Crisis. Clement Sedmak, Towards a Social Theology of the Child, Catholic Social Tradition and Child Studies and Dialogue. And our committee member, Kristen Valentino's own project, Evaluating the Efficacy of Child Abuse Prevention Programs in Catholic Elementary Schools. I think you can see that a number of different projects from a range of perspectives were funded by the very same group that funded this conference. It is our hope that in the months ahead, those who've undertaken these projects will have an opportunity to gather and share insights we've gained through our work supported by this initiative. I should say that there are a number of other initiatives, many of these are perhaps familiar to you, going on at other universities. Fordham University's Taking Responsibility project, for which there are archived videos on Fordham's website. The Task Force on the Sexual Abuse Crisis at Villanova University, also archived videos on their website. The Religion and Sexual Abuse Project at University of California, Riverside, which is hosting a conference these same days as this conference. And Boston College's Church in the 21st Century Initiative, and also at their law school, has undertaken important work on this topic as well. I offer that just to encourage us to think about the work we're doing here in dialogue with other projects that are going on around the country on this issue. There is actually an interesting research bibliography that's posted on Notre Dame's website through the Cushwa Center for the Study of American Catholicism, authored by Brian Kleitz, Breaking the Silence, A Primer to Research on Clergy Sexual Abuse. So if you're interested in reading more about the topics, you might look at Professor Kleitz's article on that. A quick word on the aims of what we're going to do over the next couple days. The aims of this conference are outlined in your program: to explore practical strategies to increase accountability, promote healing, and rebuild trust in the life of the Catholic Church in the aftermath of the clergy sexual abuse crisis. Our focus will be on the needs of local parishes, their leaders and staff, including educators in Catholic schools. The conference will also explore the intersection of parish life and the formation of ordained and lay ecclesial ministers in seminaries, dioceses, and Catholic universities. Scholars of theology, psychology, and law will present recent research on these issues in conversation with those working in ministerial settings who have developed approaches and practical programs to address the needs of Catholic parishioners, students, and church leaders during these challenging times. The reason for these particular aims is twofold. First, the original grant from the Office of Research strongly supported our proposal that research on the abuse crisis would greatly benefit from focusing on the theoretical and practical ways that theology, psychology, and law intersect in the life of the Church. The grant from the College of Arts and Letters supports work that brings research efforts underway at Notre Dame to a wider audience on campus and the local community. In the judgment of the conference committee, the best way to link those two aims, to explore the intersection of theology, psychology, and law on the one hand, and to link research on the abuse crisis to the needs of the local community on the other, would be to focus on the practice of ministry. Understood broadly, parishes, Catholic schools, dioceses, social service organizations, and both for those actively working in ministry, broadly understood, and those preparing for ministry. Indeed, many of the questions, conversations with, questions posed by, insights brought by students in our own ministry program at Notre Dame helped us to envision the panel topics that we've invited our panelists to speak on over the next couple of days. Third point, logistics. This is both for those gathered here and also those that are joining us online. All of our sessions will take place in this room in McKenna Hall, except for those occasions where we'll gather for prayer and meals. Due to scheduling conflicts and some late arising health issues, some of our panelists will be joining us remotely although you'll have a chance to ask them questions during the discussion period that follows each panel presentation. For those joining us online, you're welcome to pose questions to the panelists, and we'll do our best to take some questions from the online group in each session, in addition to questions posed by those gathered here on site. I'd also mention that for those who are gathered on site, if you'd like to ask questions, we ask that you use the microphone that is at the front of the room. I'll be available, or Kim will be available, to walk the microphone over to the various tables. You're also welcome, if you'd like, to write down questions and pass them to me or to Kim. If for some reason you're not comfortable asking the question yourself, one of us will read the question so it can be posed to the panelists. Okay, at this time, I'd like to just pause a minute and invite Kim Belcher to tell you a little bit about the liturgies that we have planned for this weekend, and then I'll rejoin you to cover a few more logistics.
Thank you. For those of you who are here in person, we'll have opportunities to pray together throughout the conference, and I know oftentimes when we gather for conferences, we pray together. One of the things that I think is unique about this is that I came to this conference with a sense that when we do liturgy in the context of the sexual abuse crisis, we are opening up the possibility of either doing further harm with our liturgy or of promoting healing with our liturgies. And so one of the things that I tried to do with these liturgies is I tried kind of to have three different aims. I tried to think about our needs as we gather together to talk about difficult issues and to grapple with difficult conversations. So those needs for us to be strengthened and to bond together as a community, but also to think about giving an opportunity for you to take perhaps some new ideas back to your home locations in parishes and educational institutions that you could use to help your communities pray together in the wake of the sexual abuse crisis. So in doing this work, I was joined by Julia Belfi, who's a PhD student in liturgical studies here at Notre Dame. She's in a class right now, she'll be with us soon. And Eric Stiles, who's the rector of Carroll Hall here on campus. And we have had two main sources of inspiration. The first, which you'll see if you look at your liturgy programs in your booklet, is the St. John's Bible illustration of the dry bones from Ezekiel 36 and 37. Which actually appears in the breviary for these first few days of Lent. So it's actually very timely. But what we've done is we have used this text to spark some musical and some prayerful reflection time. So Ron Harbour has composed a new musical piece for us to sing together. We'll also be singing one of his psalms. Thanks to Eric Stiles, who got in touch with him. John Kyler from Liturgical Press and Ron Robb are going to assist us with Stations of the Cross that's especially meant as a response to the sexual abuse crisis. That's tomorrow night. So our evening prayer this afternoon will really reflect on this image and the dry bones scriptures. Tomorrow night we'll be doing special Stations of the Cross. And then on Saturday night, we'll be getting together with JJ Wright and the Notre Dame Pope Choir for the initial performance of their Passion, which was partly inspired by students and composers and musicians' reflections on the sexual abuse crisis in the church. So those two things, this image from the St. John's Bible and the Passion that the folk choir has put together over the past 3 years have been a primary thematic influence for what we'll be doing together at liturgy. And everything you need for those liturgies, including the locations and the times, are in this booklet. And then you should also have a Stations of the Cross booklet. Is it in there? I just realized that I don't see it.
I don't think those are gonna be handed out until people show up.
We'll get those at the liturgy tomorrow then. Great, thank you very much. All right, I look forward to praying with you.
Thanks, Kim. So just a final note on some of our logistics. All of the meals for the panelists will take place in the Morris Inn. And as Kim mentioned, the locations for morning and evening prayer and for choir performance of the Passion are listed in the worship aid. We'd like to note one small error in the program. This evening's panel actually is going to run from 7:30 to 8:45, not 8:15. We're not going to try to get all of that in that short period of time. So we apologize for the typo there. So please make that correction. We have our station for coffee break set up right outside the conference room. And also please join us for the receptions that will take place tonight at 9 and tomorrow at 8:30, where we'll have an opportunity to continue our conversations after the formal conference sessions are concluded for the day. All right.
And where are the receptions?
The receptions are going to be here. I think they're going to be set up in the same place where the current coffee station set up. Will any other kind of announcements on the logistics will be provided by Amber Kirk. You met on your way into the conference room. Okay. So that's all we have by way of formal introductory remarks. We're scheduled to start our first panel, the Keynote Panel Accountability, Healing and Trust, Framing Questions in Ecclesial Contexts at 1:30. So that's about 7 minutes or so from now. And so we'll break until then and get things set up here. But thank you all again for your willingness to be with us. And we very much hope this is a good time for you and for thinking and discussing about the issues we'll be raising over the next few days. Thanks.
Welcome everyone to the conference and to the keynote panel discussion. I'll be your moderator convener for today. I'm Dr. Susan Fethergill. So I'm excited to introduce our keynote panel, which includes the Reverend Gerald McGlone. He is a senior research fellow at the Berkeley Center for Religion, Peace, and World Affairs. Previously, he was an assistant professor of psychiatry at Georgetown University School of Medicine. Most recently, he was the associate director for protection of minors for the Conference of Major Superiors of Men. He was also recently chief psychologist, and the director of counseling services, as well as faculty and staff at several major treatment centers for clergy and religious in the United States. He has been executive director at several major treatment centers for clergy and religious in the United States, St. John Vianney Center and Guest House Incorporated. You can access Father Jerry's work on this issue at the Berkeley Center website. We will also have with us virtually Professor Miriam Weilen, who holds a licentiate in theology from the Netherlands, a PhD in canon law. She is currently full professor of canon law at the University of Erfurt in Germany and served as vice president of her university. Pope Francis appointed her in 2021 as consultant to the Synod of Bishops in Rome, where she engages in the steering group for the current synod on synodality. Pope Francis appointed her as member to the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors. Bringing her expertise in abuse cases and necessary canonical reforms of church structures together, she was awarded a 3-year full-time research grant entitled Transparency, Accountability, Responsibility, reform of church structures and practices. Professor Wylens has published monographs and edited numerous books and more than 120 articles in scholarly periodicals. We also have Dr. Jennifer Besti. She is the chair of the College of St. Benedict Koch in Catholic Thought and Culture and professor of theology at the College of St. Benedict and St. John's University. She is author of College Hookup Culture and Christian Ethics, The Lives and Longings of Emerging Adults, and God and the Victim. Traumatic Intrusions on Grace and Freedom as well. Her two most recent articles related to clergy sexual abuse were published in 2021 in Theological Studies and the Journal of the Society of Christian Ethics. She is a member of the Notre Dame Cushwa Center's research project, Gender, Sex, and Power, towards a history of clergy sex abuse in the U.S. Catholic Church. So we will have each panelist speak for approximately 20 minutes, and then when all panelists are finished, we will have about 15 to 20 minutes for questions. Thank you.
Thank you, Susan, and I really would like to thank David and Kim for inviting me to participate in this really important conference for our church. It is an honor to be on this panel with Dr. Wylens and Dr. McGlone. They are such distinguished scholars. In his motu proprio, "You are the light of the world," Pope Francis writes, "The crimes of sexual abuse offend our Lord, cause physical, psychological, and spiritual damage to the victims, and harm the community of the faithful. In order that these phenomena, in all their forms, never happen again, a continuous and profound conversion of hearts is needed, attested by concrete and effective actions that involve everyone in the church. In the next several minutes, I will identify concrete, effective actions on 4 commitments that demonstrate the kind of conversion we as a church require. I will also name 2 challenges that threaten to undermine necessary ecclesial reforms. Finally, I will explore how Catholic theology is indispensable for navigating a difficult road ahead. According to the Catholic tradition, authentic metanoia and genuine change occur when a person confesses one's sins, expresses sincere contrition, performs penance, and makes reparation for harm caused. Applying this theological logic and practicing our own Catholic penitential rite, if we apply this to the global clergy sexual abuse crisis, it means prioritizing at least 4 commitments. First, all religious leaders need to be transparent about past and present clergy sexual abuse and disclose the truth about how bishops, priests, and laity responded to clergy sex abusers and victims. Acting on this commitment would involve, for example, making all records and files and archives accessible. Second, the path to conversion requires a commitment to do everything possible to prevent clergy abuse, cover-up, apathy, and other unsupportive responses to victims. This involves implementing best practices of highly reliable organizations to decrease risk factors for abuse. Third, progress involves a commitment to do whatever is needed to repair all the negative effects of clergy sex abuse and foster survivors' holistic healing. Fourth, it requires holding priest perpetrators and leaders accountable by again utilizing best practices like instituting a universal zero tolerance policy for clergy sex offenders and church officials who engage in cover-up and negligence. While many challenges threaten our ability to realize these commitments, I wish to focus on 2 in particular. First, Catholic leaders have not yet acknowledged the scope of clergy sexual abuse and the depth of harm caused by such abuse. For example, Pope Francis has not clearly acknowledged publicly or in canon law that it is not only minors, seminarians, and religious sisters who experience clerical abuse of power that includes but is not limited to sexual abuse. Lay adult women and men have also been sexually and spiritually abused by clerics due to the nature of the ministerial relationship and power differentials. Such denial in 2022 is not only profoundly ethically concerning, but it is embarrassingly out of step with minimal standards of professional ethics in secular caregiving professions and in other religious denominations. For instance, since the 1990s to 2000s, mainline Protestant leaders have acknowledged the severe harm of clergy sexual misconduct and have prioritized educating their seminarians about the subtle ways clerics can abuse their power, trust, and authority. I remember going to one of these seminars at Yale when I was a graduate student in 1997. They have demonstrated accountability by enacting zero tolerance policies. These professionals recognize that meaningful consent for sexual activity is not possible in a fiduciary relationship. Many Catholic leaders have also chosen not to acknowledge or redress the depth of harm and lifelong debilitating effects of clergy sexual abuse. In the USCCB Charter, for instance, bishops promise to, quote, demonstrate a sincere commitment to victims' spiritual and emotional well-being, unquote. Besides the fact that they do not specify what minimal forms of support all survivors should receive that would demonstrate a sincere commitment, limiting support to psychological and spiritual domains in the Charter ignores the severe physiological and somatic harms and the negative impact the abuse has on survivors' capacities to form a coherent sense of self, exercise effective agency, and develop healthy interpersonal relationships. Research studies consistently find that some clergy abuse survivors have been unable to graduate from school or maintain regular employment due to the incapacitating physical and mental health issues. Many survivors, I know some of them, are homeless. Failing to provide additional forms of assistance when needed is especially concerning when we consider that canon law obligates the hierarchy to provide for clergy sex abusers' basic needs, like shelter, food, they have health care for the rest of their lives, even though they no longer work. Providing clergy sex offenders with basic needs while denying the same care for their victims violates minimal norms of justice, not to mention our obligations to practice a preferential option for the powerless and marginalized, and to prioritize reparation for victims. A second main challenge is the often acknowledged negative and toxic clericalist culture and the Church's hierarchical organizational structure. Together, these sabotage all four commitments I have named to first disclose the truth, second, effectively prevent clergy abuse, third, relate justly to victims, and fourth, hold clergy sex offenders and bishops accountable. The USCCB's own appointed John Jay researcher, Karen Terry, has concluded that the complex hierarchy and structure of the Church and, quote, the inherent system of culture and power and teachings and beliefs continues to place children at high risk for clergy sexual abuse in the Catholic Church. Continues. Global research findings about the Church's hierarchical power structure concur. Despite Pope Francis's promise to eradicate clergy sex abuse and pursue justice for survivors, he has not altered the hierarchical structure of the Church in canon law. Each bishop remains the final arbiter in diocesan decision-making. Recent changes in Francis's motu proprio reinforce and strengthen this clerical privilege. For instance, adherence to the U.S. Charter for the Protection of Children is not binding. Bishops face no serious consequences like removal from office or active ministry if they do not comply with or effectively implement charter norms consistently. There are also no negative consequences if bishops collectively do not follow recommendations of the National Review Board, which have been to implement a more in-depth national audit, so we learn a lot more, and require parish audits, since parish audits are the only way to assess whether each parish is effectively implementing guidelines. Instead of being required to use the most effective research-based safe environment program or follow best practices concerning support for survivors' healing, each bishop decides which safe environment program he prefers and what amount of resources and forms of support to offer abuse survivors. Consequently, the quality of safe environment programs and support for survivors varies dramatically throughout the dioceses. Survivors have no recourse if their bishop refuses to offer more adequate psychological or spiritual support, because the bishop is the final arbiter. In my conversations with survivors over the past 15 years in many different states, I have been deeply troubled as I have listened to them describe the lack of support from many Catholic clergy and laity. As recently as a month ago, one survivor told me that her diocese limited her therapy to only 4 sessions, which she was told, quote, should be sufficient for your healing, unquote. Another survivor shared that the only request she asked of her bishop after her accuser was credibly found, credibly accused, was to create a peer support group for clergy abuse survivors. Although she met with her bishop and others in the diocese for 6 years annually to make this request, the diocese never collaborated or cooperated. In 2021, she gave up. Quote, if the bishop wanted there to be a peer support group, there would be a peer support group. It has been very distressing to me to realize this fact, unquote. Facing significant challenges such as the ones I have briefly considered, how do we move forward? And how can Catholic theology serve as a resource to help us create a genuinely safe, accountable culture? First, theology can help us clearly see what is at stake and whether or not we undergo serious conversion and radical reform. Theologically, nothing less is at stake than the Church's very purpose for its existence, to mediate God's love and healing grace to the world. If we take trauma research findings that our capacities to form a constructive sense of self, act freely, and engage in loving relationships can be gravely debilitated by severe interpersonal harm, we recognize our interdependence not only on God, but on other persons and creation. Since we are finite, limited beings who experience reality in tangible ways, we need God's grace to be mediated through our embodied experiences. At all times, God is seeking to mediate grace to us through creation, the Church, and its ministers. However, our ability to experience and respond to such grace can be subverted by other persons who perpetrate extreme moral harm or fail to accept responsibility to repair that harm. Pope Francis's framing of clergy perpetrators as tools of Satan is not an overreach, for the extent of harm they inflict on victims can and often does result in soul murder, suicide, and so many premature deaths of survivors, and I have learned often even their family members. Right now, the body of Christ is broken. Familiar words of Jesus tell us, just as you did it to one of the least of these who are members of my family, you did it to me. It is difficult to think about this, but each time a clergy perpetrator sexually abuses a girl or a boy, a woman or a man, he is sexually abusing the body of Jesus Christ. The body of Christ is further splintered and fragmented whenever bishops promise publicly to offer adequate support and pastoral care to victims and then fail to do so. Whenever clergy and lay Catholics react unsupportively or apathetically to survivors. And whenever church leaders sin by omission by failing to urgently implement best practices to prevent clergy abuse globally and relate to survivors justly. As these sins of commission and omission accumulate, both clergy and laity are complicit in the continued abuse of Christ and victims' bodies and spirits. The good news is that our Catholic faith can provide us the strength and motivation to accompany survivors in solidarity so that evil and traumatization need not be the final word. Exploring the intersections between Catholic theology and trauma research on recovery allows us to recognize that loving support can break the traumatic cycle, enabling survivors' recovery and their ability to relate constructively to themselves, others, and God. Trauma survivors' experiences of recovery strongly suggest that God has ordered creation and redemption in such a way that God relies on our acts of neighbor love to mediate divine grace. Is this not deeply embedded in the Catholic affirmation that Christian discipleship involves us working as co-creators, as Pope Francis says, as co-responsible to bring about the kingdom of God? Moreover, as Catholics, we believe that our communion with Christ and celebration of his resurrection occurs as a result of accompanying him through the events of his passion. Seeing Christ in the least of our brothers and sisters and treating them as Christ would calls us all to be in solidarity with survivors. Collectively, Catholics have extraordinarily diverse and abundant gifts and talents to create trauma-informed communities that intentionally provide a safe, supportive space for survivors. I am sure that many of us at this conference are actively engaging in this kind of incredible work. It is, of course, incredibly important that we do recognize and say a prayer of gratitude to all lay Catholics, clergy, lay ecclesial ministers, teachers, and parish staff who, past and present, have responded courageously to the Holy Spirit's call to protect the safety of all those in their care and to support survivors. The challenge before us is to make their lived witness of the gospel the widespread norm for all of us. Once we understand what is at stake in our response to clergy sexual abuse, a second task of theology is to help us discern what it means to follow Christ and respond as he would to our global crisis of clergy abuse. Scriptural accounts of Jesus reveal the high priority God places on caring for and protecting children and those who are suffering. Mark, Matthew, and Luke all include the gospel narrative of Jesus rebuking his apostles when they try to prevent children from getting too close to Jesus. Jesus reacts with anger, and as certain scripture scholars have pointed out, this is very significant because he only reacts with anger twice in the gospel narratives. And he responds, "Let the children come to me. Do not hinder them, for to such belongs the kingdom of God. Truly, I say to you, whoever does not receive the kingdom of God like a child shall not enter it." By affirming that his apostles, their apostolic successors, and his followers must become like children to enter the kingdom of God, Christ is subverting the values of the kingdom of the world with its obsession on status, hierarchy, and power over others, and lauds the opposite values of the kingdom of God. The theologian in me is tempted to engage more scriptural and theological narratives of Jesus Christ, to make an earnest case that Christian discipleship calls all of us to place support for survivors' healing and the safety of Catholics above all other interests and agendas in our church. And yet, perhaps we don't really need a lengthy theological exposition. Is there anyone among us who finds it hard to imagine that Jesus would not immediately prioritize the church's resources to do everything possible to ensure the safety of Catholics and practice a preferential option for survivors who have been deeply wounded and betrayed by those who are Christ's earthly representatives? A third task of Catholic theology, indispensable for those who study past and present clergy abuse, is to unpack and engage in reforms on the Catholic macrosystem level. According to sex abuse prevention specialists globally, in order to create a safe, accountable church or any other youth-serving organization, we need to not only reduce risk factors at the individual, interpersonal, and organizational levels of the church, but at the macro system level, where cultural beliefs, values, norms, the legal system, and ideologies of Catholic culture play out. A crucial job of Catholic theologians is to identify the theological beliefs, church teachings, values, and norms that increase risk factors for clergy sex abuse, cover-up, and lack of support to victims. To give one example, I am currently engaged in a historical research project with a Notre Dame group, and I'm examining priest-perpetrator files in one particular Midwestern archdiocese. I am conducting a qualitative analysis to identify the religious beliefs that influence clergy and lay Catholics to cover up abuse and support priest-perpetrators' interests over those of victims. My analysis thus far indicates that theologically problematic and distorted beliefs about God, sin, forgiveness, grace, the priesthood, and prayer undergirded church officials and lay Catholics' choices to support priest-perpetrators rather than caring for their victims and ensuring their community's safety. Once we identify the ways in which our Catholic beliefs and teachings become distorted and function to enable abuse rather than deter it, our task as Christians is to eradicate these distorted elements of our tradition. As Pope Benedict acknowledged early in his own theological career, quote, "Not everything that exists in the church must for that reason be also a legitimate tradition. Not every tradition that arises in the church is a true celebration and keeping present of the mystery of Christ. There is a distorting as well as a legitimate tradition," unquote. When theologians, clergy, canon lawyers, and Catholic laity have worked together to eradicate these distorted beliefs and traditions, our next creative task as a church is to mine our 2,000 years of theological tradition, to revise our beliefs, values, and ecclesial structures, to help us create and maintain a genuine culture of safety, transparency, and accountability. Only then will abuse survivors, lay Catholics, and priests be able to trust in the integrity of their leaders and trust that they are part of a church that truly is acting as the body of Christ, mediating divine love in service to humanity and creation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jennifer, for your thoughts and your insights and recommendations. We'll now hear from my friend and colleague, Reverend and Dr. Jerry McGlone.
Good afternoon, everybody. Well, you're like every Catholic audience I preach to. Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you. I knew you were there. I could see you. Now, actually being face-to-face is such a pandemic joy, post-pandemic joy, to be able to do this. I'm incredibly honored to be here. I am actually reminiscing about the fact that I applied to Notre Dame in 1975 and was accepted, but took off a different offer of entering the Jesuits. And so somehow God has a way of always repairing damage, and coming back with the true reality of what's going on. I too want to add my thanks, first of all, to you, David, and to you, Kim, and to all who've made this moment possible. I also want to start with a very important caveat that, first of all, I'm going to be talking about deficiencies. I'm going to be talking about the ways in which the body of Christ is wounded. But what I think we also need to be talking about and mentioning right from the get-go is how many clergy and religious and how many lay people are faithful servants. And let's never forget that. And let's always have that as the context, that we begin with. Secondarily, I think it's really important that we begin to look at what does it mean for us to speak of traumas. So I'll be speaking of multiple traumas today. The image you have in front of you is a very powerful image, isn't it? Of a time when we were called literally into the darkness of the moment, into the chaos of what was happening, and most especially into the unknown and into the ways in which we don't have solutions. In any conversation, and the reason why I'm in shirt and tie and not in a collar is because I want to be sensitive to those who are watching, who are survivors, and those of you in the audience who are survivors of clerical sexual abuse. As you so aptly said, Kimberly, our liturgies, our words, the ways in which we interact have to be adapted to the reality. When you come to a conference on sexual abuse in the Catholic Church, what you wear matters. And I think it's really important that we be sensitive to that. Now, of course, I'm a Jesuit, and coats and ties are familiar in our sort of tradition. But that being said, today we're faced with the normal, complex, global, ecclesial, and national issues. I want to give a warning to all survivors that I'm going to get very personal, and so this may stir various issues in you. I want you, whether you're watching at home or whether you're here, to feel free to leave and feel free to take care of yourself first and foremost. I assume that my audience, half of my audience will be trauma survivors. I will assume that at least 25% of my audience of women have experienced sexual assault before the age of 18. Excuse me. I can scarcely remember a time, as you look at this image, when we are faced with so many different personal, communal, national, global traumas all at once. Some of these images, like this one in front of you, are breathtaking. We are looking at a blood-stained, battered Ukrainian woman who has a name, who has a family, who has a home that has been destroyed. The senseless killing of innocents cannot escape our consciousness. Let me say that again. The senseless killing of innocents and murderous activity cannot escape our consciousness. And I want you to be with this image and feel the moral outrage that the world is experiencing for a moment. That moral outrage is necessary to deal with the sexual abuse crisis in the Catholic Church. The outrage raised in Chile by Juan Carlos Ruiz. The outrage of a Catholic cardinal who befriended a pope for years. The outrage of a Catholic cardinal who abused children and adults. The outrage of various Vatican officials and cardinals who have not yet learned how to say I'm sorry. The outrage that we experienced in 1 year alone. Chile was January of 2018. June was the McCarrick Report of 2018. and August was the Pennsylvania Grand Jury Report of 2018. We have entered the third phase of what this crisis is about, a third phase that calls out for institutional systematic change and calls out for several different perspectives to be looked at. Can we indeed look at this man who has been under attack in France, who I interviewed just a couple of days ago, Jean-Marc Sauvé, a faithful Catholic, who simply reported the details of what he discovered in the past 2 years of the French Commission. If anything else, what we're realizing, as a dear friend, new friend, Sister Nuala Kinney from Canada has said, enough's enough. We now have data from Australia, from England, from Ireland, from the United States, from Canada, from Germany, and now from France, and yet more studies to come from Spain and from Portugal and elsewhere. We know what the problem is. Enough is enough. There are images of past traumas, and most especially the trauma of the pandemic and all that we've experienced in that, and more impending traumas. These are history-changing events. I hope this conference can be counted among them. The current context matters, and in places past attempts to manage this scandal, which started for us in the United States in 1992, then in 2002 and 2018, and now where we see a plethora of unimaginable global horror, staggering new numbers, as Jennifer referred to, of women who are being raped and abused now within the Catholic Church. Staggering numbers of those who've been assaulted in rectories and churches. This is and will be overwhelming for you. As someone trained in psychology, I want you to just breathe for a moment. Just breathe, because what I'm about to share can and might indeed be rather frightening. But I also want to take a deep breath, and perhaps we might be invited into a particular scriptural place, a place that you're familiar with of the upper room, where there was enormous confusion, enormous survivors of trauma, a sense of how they witnessed to horrific violence, the betrayal of their leaders, their friends, a sense of enormous grief and pain, and being utterly consumed by fear, not knowing what the future would entail or what ought to happen, feeling utter disgust for what their leaders, their apostles, their friends had done in abandoning their leader, most especially sitting in the confusion and the chaos. Again, I say, just breathe. As a faith community, we've been through these moments before, and we flourished because of them. The example of the early church might indeed give us pause to hope. Perhaps it might point the way to managing being so utterly exhausted, as I'm sure you are, as I am, of the pandemic, of this issue that does not seem to go away, and the feeling of being overwhelmed. First and foremost, besides answering this question, I stand before you as one who is quite attached to this issue. I am a survivor of clerical sexual abuse as a child. I am a survivor of clerical sexual misconduct as an adult and harassment. So this matters to me personally, spiritually, and psychologically. These moments and these issues that we've seen nationally in regards to facing our white imperialism, and the Black Lives Matter and the death of George Floyd, raised to me, being at Georgetown, the issue of being the descendant of a former slave owner who was a brother Jesuit. It also raises in me, when I see the Jesuit scandals of these past 2 years, of the presidents of Regis High School and Santa Clara University, and of a Jesuit in the southern province being accused of rape, and the former provost of Georgetown University having multiple allegations being brought forward in just these past 2 years. I speak because I will not allow an institution or my abuser to claim who I am and my vocation. I speak because I will not allow the nefarious disregard of survivors that Jennifer so eloquently pointed out to ever silence my voice to speak for survivors who are simply being neglected in this very moment now. That should be the same moral outrage the world has experienced in regards to Putin's invasion. Might we regain that same moral outrage so that we give voice to those who often have none? These framing questions, I think, are essential. What might a survivor's perspective be like? How might these resources best be used in the service of our beloved church? And what distinctive questions and resources do I, as a psychologist, bring to the table? Most especially, how do we repair betrayal? As always, let me start with the via negativa. Survivor's perspective. It is not perpetrator-based. And my essential hypothesis is what we've gotten wrong is that we've been so protecting of the institution and of the perpetrator, we've forgotten about our own mission and identity as who we are as evangelizers. It's always been about saving reputation, and it cannot be any longer. It is not a CYO, and I do not refer to a Catholic youth organization in that statement. It's a CYA response that it cannot be. If you need Jesuit translation, I'll see you at the break. It's not a one-and-done approach. It is not solely about policies and audits. There is clearly, after all of these years, no simple solution. I invite you to breathe yet again. I love Paul Tillich, and his phrase has always captivated me, because if we have a survivor's perspective, then this is the essential clarion call of what it means to have a survivor's perspective. To listen, show up, and believe. It's really pretty simple. Listen, show up, and believe. Isn't that the core of our faith tradition? Is that not what we're being called to in an extraordinary way? He then further explains in this wonderful quote that in order to know what is just, listen to his language, in order to know what is just in a person-to-person encounter, love listens. It is its first task to listen. Then further in that quote it goes, they want us to listen, they want us to understand their intrinsic claims, human beings, and their justice of being in the world, which for any survivor is always in question. What we see, what we hear, what we know is always suspect, because that's what our perpetrator told us. But we can give it to them only through the love which listens. Relationships heal. So what are the dynamics of a survivor's perspective? To be survivor-based approach from the beginning to end, it's about a listening, believing, and a listening again and again. It's about the accountability that no one else will get hurt. When I reported what had happened to me, my concern was that this stop and never happen again. I never asked for, nor have I received any monetary compensation. That's a myth of why survivors come forward. It is an excruciating act of courage to go against a man of God who said that he was doing this because of love. The distorted beliefs of a perpetrator inculcate our ecclesial system, so that the system itself becomes a perpetrator. It is about regaining, refounding, reforming our pastoral mission, our gospel mission. Indeed, it's really a very traditional reality. What it means is that we reclaim the sacred. We reclaim who God is, and with moral indignation, we ask the church to go back to the standards of what it means to be a moral institution. So it's got to be multidimensional. I would claim we need to have a new catechesis of survivor stories, experiences, and narratives. That's one of my research projects right now. What's the most effective medium to tell a survivor story, and how can we make that available to you in parishes, in universities, in religious orders, in training seminarians, in training of bishops and major superiors? It's about an auditing of care and compassion, as Jennifer so eloquently talked about. There is nothing in the current audit that gives us information about how well we are caring for survivors long term. How dare us not do that? That's outrageous. For 20 years, we've been asking the same questions. For 20 years, we've not gotten this right. At what point do the people of God say, enough, and hear the cries of the poor? It is about having a trauma-informed church, pastoral care practice, and theology. Many other writers are writing about that. But how is your pastoral practice in your parishes, your universities, your students who will come to you with enormous experiences of trauma, geared towards a trauma-based reality? Most especially, it is a systemic problem, so therefore we need systemic responses. It is about reclaiming that moral sacredness. And new models are needed. You will hear about those new models. You'll hear about the concept of moral injury. You will hear about what that means then in regards to how the soul is raped and murdered on a regular basis, even as I speak. Even as I speak. So what might healing look like? So what's worked? We can look at the fact that, in June we'll mark 20 years of the charter. The infrastructure's there, important data we found out from what the perpetrators are like. We've been, policies are in place, audits are done annually, trainings are being done. The USCCB rightly has listened to those psychologists who've spoken to them, and we've created guidelines for screening and assessment. But we do not know how well they are applied, and we do not know, indeed, how and why those assessment practices are still deficient. If you follow the story in Cleveland, we had a newly ordained priest who just committed suicide in prison because of his online perpetration of children. He was ordained 4 years. What is happening? In 2018, showed that McCarrick was caught because the new infrastructure actually worked. And I think we need to say that McCarrick's horror would not have come forward without the fact that policies were indeed in place. Pennsylvania grand jury, however, showed us that the dimensions of the horror is there. However, what's not working? You can't continue to use old wineskins. You can't find the full new dimensions and think that the old infrastructure is sufficient. Didn't we just pass a bipartisan infrastructure bill in order to change structures that are simply insufficient and decaying? We need more data and research on the short and long-term effectiveness of the program. There is a huge gap that there's no audit for the type of care being done with survivors. I hear on a daily basis from survivors about how diocesan victim assistance coordinators are simply ignoring them. Jennifer cited personal examples. That has to stop. It is absolutely unimaginable that in today's reality that is still happening. We know that there are damaging long-term effects of being abused. We know there are higher rates of depression, anxiety, suicidality, addictions. We know that. How in God's name could the church not accompany someone with those issues because of what the church has allowed to happen? How do we know that assessments and screening of candidates is working? Where is the ongoing assessment to assess the role of formation in seminaries? And for God's sake, with the Cleveland example, how do we know that the first years of pastoral ministry are indeed healthy? Where is the ongoing assessment in regards to, we have initial assessment of candidates, and I've written extensively on the necessity of that, but there is no ongoing assessment to determine the effect of formation in seminaries. As Susan goes to the Pontifical North American College, as I was there as chief psychologist, one of my biggest concerns there was seeing the absolute apparent grooming of bishops and cardinals with their seminarians into the hierarchialism, as Jim Keenan has named, into the clericalism that is the son and daughter of hierarchialism. Privilege and power and prestige are not about ordination, and it's been confused all too often. We need a further analysis, in order to understand what does it mean for us who are still suffering. Because as Jennifer pointed out, the body of Christ is broken, it's bleeding in my view. But where is that moral indignation of our leaders? Why are there no leaders in the local church here now? Where are the major superiors? How in God's name can we move forward if we don't have that same moral outrage we experienced with Putin's actions as we do with our own ecclesial and religious actions? What are the distinctive questions? What are the distinctive ways that we can begin to look at this? Well, as I tell my clients and have for years, you cannot run from the pain, but you simply have to be in it. You have to learn what the information is within it, but for God's sake, learn how to shut it off. Know whether you process information externally and internally, but also the nature of a perpetration is to keep you secret and silence and isolate, and try to avoid that. What distinctive questions or resources can we name? As a psychologist, one of the first things I want to know is, well, what is the problem we're dealing with? So I have to have a diagnosis. What is the it? I can't change it unless I know what the it is. If the it is abuse of role and power, if we believe that seeking privilege and perks, if we believe that surrounding yourself with sycophants, then we do have a good diagnosis. It's called acquired situational narcissism. It comes out of research in the early 2000s from a man in New York who was treating all of these actors and sports stars who suddenly came in to power, prestige, and money. And gee, what were they like? See if this resonates with your experience of certain individuals in the church. There was a huge superiority complex. They pretended to be something in one place and different in another. They view others as superior or inferior, but rarely equal. And the sense of entitlement was overwhelming. They always expect to be treated special. They have condescending verbal or nonverbal expressions and often leading into bullying. The key word in the diagnosis is if you change the situation and the power dynamics, you change the disorder. And oh, by the way, they surround themselves with wonderful sycophants, with wonderful people who only say what they want to hear and make sure they never disagree with His holiness or His excellency. I think this is a really important diagnosis to grapple with, don't you? That what we're dealing with here is actually fairly obvious and fairly important to address. Jim Keenan has recently, as of just the other day, Whoops. We have a slide issue. I'm going to give you this quote. Just in theological studies, he put out this that I think is a brilliant way of analyzing. Gosh. It's the pandemic. The ways in which we have failed in using the term clericalism, because it's an attack often seen by priests and by other religious as an attack on the priesthood, when in reality it's not. It's about the ways in which ordination and privilege is used. And the most insidious form of this is this hierarchialism, which I think is a magnificent way of describing a distinctive, protected, powerful culture. And that's the key for us in what we address. That is, generate many of the contemporary problems in the church that compromise her mission and who we are. I think I'm about near my time. One of the things that I do in order to grapple with my own history of abuse is I read a lot of poetry. And I visit a lot of museums. And oh, by the way, the one way you can deal with this phenomenon is to take a walk. That we know in research that the experience of awe, A-W-E, releases certain chemicals in the brain that actually reduces stress. And so I encourage you, you survivors who are listening, and all of us, to also read, particularly women poets. Oh, do you have time to linger for just a little while out of your busy and very important days on campus for the goldfinches that have gathered in a field of thistles for a musical battle to see who can sing the highest note with the lowest and most expressive of mirth, the most tender. Their strong, blunt beaks drink the air as they stride melodiously, not for your sake and not for mine, and not for the sake of winning, but for sheer delight and gratitude. Believe us, they say, it is a serious thing just to be alive in this fresh morning in the broken world. I beg of you, do not walk by without pausing to attend to this rather ridiculous performance. It could mean something. It could mean everything. It could mean what Rilke meant when he wrote, "You must change your life." One of the key aspects of what does it mean for us to become more who we are is to really look at that upper room. This is just a magnificent painting or picture. I'm going to try to point out with my... Here is Mary Magdalene coming in to this depiction of the upper room. Can you see that? What's it look like? You can, again, try to be Protestant at this point. Just speak up in church. What's it look like? Dark. Scary. What else? Chaotic. What else? Faceless. Exactly. You don't have any clear details of who's there, do you? Brilliant. What else does it look like for you? What does it stir in you? Weariness. Perhaps you and I are being invited into this unique upper room moment. But go there as a witness, as Ignatius would say. Imagine what you see. Imagine you see Thomas, Peter, Andrew, who approached the Mother of God. I figure I might use a Mary image here at Notre Dame to stir your hearts, minds, and bodies. Imagine the fact that they had to be enveloped in the bloody mantle of Mary, whose mantle had just held the bloodied body of her beloved. And what did she say to them? You as witnesses to the trauma of what we see in war and what we see in our church, can we allow this wounded body of this church to go to her? What do you know now? What do you feel now? What do you see now? And can you hear the century-old words echoing throughout the earth? That when Jesus broke through our fear and chaos, he said, Shalom. Can we feel the breath of God into our chaos yet again and recreate the world. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Reverend Jerry. We'll now hear virtually from Professor Miriam Wylens.
Denying, covering up, listening, shaming, acknowledging, preventing, holding accountable, administering justice, transparency, healing. These verbs characterize the various stages of the Catholic Church's learning process with regard to sexual abuse of minors and vulnerable persons. They point to a turnaround that entails a slowly and extremely painful moving away from reflexively protecting the institution and clergy to protecting minors and now as well vulnerable adults. It is also a move away from focusing on the violation of celibacy to focusing on the violation of the dignity of the human person. The turnaround implies as well a widening of perspective with regard to justice and accountability. The focus is not any longer just on the perpetrators of sexual abuse, but also on those who, in light of their ecclesiastical office, seriously failed in responding to allegations of abuse. It is a move from covering up to administering justice, which requires transparency, and which then can lead to a church whose leaders are being held accountable. Gradually, church leaders do realize that the trust that had been placed in the church, both by church members and by society at large, and that was abused, this trust, can only be restored and secured if the dignity and integrity of persons, which requires the protection of minors and vulnerable persons, as well as the administration of justice, is really put first. The church realizes that accountability of church leaders to God only is insufficient. Needed is not only a vertical, so to God, but also a horizontal accountability, which means that church leaders are being held accountable to the people of God about how they have exercised the ministry to which they are called and commissioned. A new perspective has consequences for prevention, intervention, that is when abuse is reported, and for coming to terms with the abuse that has occurred, as is the case when justice is to be administered. Consequences thus arise not only with regard to sexual abuse itself, but they extend to the way church leaders are called to fulfill their duties arising from their office. The change that is currently occurring finds reflection in the revisions in the canonical norms that have occurred over the past 20 years or so. The revision in themselves are indicative of the fact that the church finds itself not only in a learning process, but also in a learning process that is ongoing. When in 2020, the Congregation for the Doctrine of the Faith presented a Vademecum, a kind of handbook on handling allegations of sexual abuse, the prefect of that congregation, Cardinal Luis Ladaria, remarked that it was version 1. With that comment, he does indicate that most likely new insights of the ongoing learning process will lead to revised norms also in the future. In this presentation, and I'm very grateful for the invitation to speak at this conference, and I really regret that I cannot be with you in person at Notre Dame. In this presentation, I will briefly outline what the ongoing learning process has brought forward, and then I will offer some reflections relevant to the theme of our conference. So the learning process. The Catholic Church has found itself in a steep learning process with regard to sexual abuse of minors for the past 30 years or so. The learning has been characterized by two aspects. First, for many years, the learning has been a matter of reacting, not so much of acting. And yet, this presentation that I will give today reveals that the Holy See has at times reacted much quicker than many local churches. A complicating aspect in this learning process has been, and this is then the second aspect that I would like to highlight, is that it occurs in an asynchronic way. The awareness and acknowledgement that sexual abuse within the church has occurred, and has occurred more extensively than initially believed, begins in different countries around the world at different times. Once the abuse comes out into the open, the process that follows locally almost always follows a similar pattern. But this process begins at a different time. The two aspects, the asynchronity and the reaction by the Holy See, implies that for some, the Holy See is nevertheless acting too late. This is certainly often mentioned in the English-speaking world, and far too early for others because they're not even there yet. So how this development, this learning process, this learning process unfold on the level of canonical provisions and thus on the level of a reaction? I studied in Canada in the late 1980s, and it was there already that the first case came about. It was there already that the bishop had to resign in the late 1980s. So the sexual abuse of children in a church-run home became a major scandal in Canada, resulting in the resignation of the diocesan bishop, who had to admit that he had known it, but who had severely failed in responding to the abuse. Soon after, the Canadian Conference of Catholic Bishops produced guidelines for responding to reports of abuse. I was involved in drafting those, a concept for those guidelines. Although in the early 1990s, the bishops in the United States had issued guidelines and had even seen a change in canon law that was issued by Pope John Paul II at the time for their territory, where the age of minors was increased from 16 to 18 years, so this was only for the territory of the United States. It was not until the publication of the report in Spotlight by the Boston Globe and Mail, the Globus I think it is called, in 2002, which brought about a serious turnabout. Not only did the report reveal how many more clergy had been abusive than previously assumed, but it became clear that diocesan leaders had known about the problems, but had responded with transfers and covers up. Part of the cover-up process included silencing the victims with a sum of money. The report revealed that there was a system in which state authorities had also collaborated. The then Cardinal Archbishop of Boston was forced to offer his resignation. Aware that the problems of sexual abuse of minors were much more serious and extensive than many around the world were willing to acknowledge at the time, and presumably realizing already that diocesan bishops were not living up to their responsibilities, the Holy See took action in 2001, so that is before Spotlight. By means of tightening the norms, the cases of abuse of minors were then reserved to the Holy See, which meant that bishops and major superiors were not competent anymore to act, and thus to decide freely whether and how they would attend to allegations of abuse. It was one way to prevent that accused would simply be moved to another place. At the same time, the bishops were obliged to issue guidelines. 2001, the Holy See instructors around the world, they were obliged to issue guidelines on how to receive and react to reports of sexual abuse. It was an action by the Holy See to demand from bishops to act responsibly. And I think today, with the legislation we have in place since 2016 for holding bishops accountable, it means anybody who was on the scene in 2001 and involved in these norms will have to be and will hopefully be judged differently, saying from 2001 at the latest you knew there was a problem. Furthermore, in 2001 the Holy See made a few more changes with regard to the delict itself and to prescription, as we call it in canon law, or as you call it in the United States, statute of limitation. Till then, the delict had been a violation of the 6th commandment with a minor completing his or her age of 16, and this was increased to 18. You had this already in the States, but it was then adapted for the whole world. The time for prescription, the statute of limitation, was changed. Previously, it was only 5 years, beginning from the moment the last action of the delict had occurred, and now it was increased to 10 years, the clock only beginning to tick at the age of 18. And the Holy See introduced the possibility of a derogation from prescription for individual cases. However, in 2001, the reaction of many Episcopal conferences around the world was this was not a serious problem in their country. Bishops argued that in their country there were only few isolated cases. Germany was one of them. The president of the Episcopal Conference of Germany stated at the time this was really an English-speaking problem. This was not a problem in Germany. Many felt that abuse was only a real problem in the English-speaking world. Such voices could also be heard in Germany, as I just said. And finally, it took until 2010 when a tsunami of complaints came over Germany, which then also within a few weeks went over Belgium and the Netherlands. In the meantime, Ireland had seen the publication of an independent inquiry into the abuse of children in institutions run by the Catholic Church. If you just see how these things are moving already in 2005, I think it was, I was invited to be an expert on liabilities with regard to a provincial superior in the civil courts in Ireland. So Germany was still saying we don't have any problem. Ireland saw already to accountability of leaders who had moved, in this case, a brother to another school where he again abused children. It is most likely that by receiving different cases from around the world, the Holy See became aware of the complexity of them and responded with changes of the law once more in 2010. Now, the age was 18, we had this already, but it was extended to a person who habitually has the imperfect use of reason, which then would be considered this person as equivalent to a minor. It was the response to a specific case in Italy where people who were handicapped had been abused and they did not fall under the category of under 18. At the same time, they were mentally otherwise capable of acting. So they made an adaptation to that. They also in 2010 made an adaptation to pornography. Now, at that time, they only had this till the age of 14, and later the church increased this to 18. Still, I think today, in all our lectures that we do around the world, we still focus a lot on sexual abuse of minors, but we don't really speak that much yet about pornography, whereas this is an immense business, if I may say so, and qualify it like that. Certainly in Corona times, this has tremendously increased. And I think we have to pay much more attention also within the church, how our priests and religious and other people who work in the church, actually how they are using and abusing pornography. In 2010, the prescription was once more increased, now to 20 years. So let's say in 2001, a person who had been abused at the age of 11 could only complain till this person was 16. In 2001, this was then increased to the age of 28 for that same person, and now in 2010 it was increased to the age of 38, so there's quite a difference. The year 2010 was an extremely difficult year. In a number of countries, the Holy See reacted again in 2011 by obliging bishops to provide for guidelines on prevention and for the handling of allegations of abuse. Not only did many cases come forward, it became also clear that bishops had abused minors and or had possessed numerous child pornographic materials. Soon after his election, Pope Francis therefore established the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors in 2013. And he also issued a statement in 2015 saying that it's not only important to have guidelines, but to also see to it whether and how they are applied. Hence, a call to act responsible is once more issued. A year later, in 2016, Pope Francis begins to hold bishops and major superiors accountable for their actions with the motu proprio Una Madre Amorevole. 2016, this is before Chile. So the Holy See again issues a decree and a norm that bishops must pay vigilant attention to protecting the weakest of those entrusted to her care. And that canon law does not only already provide for the possibility of removal from an ecclesiastical office, but the decree states that this is also applicable to bishops. It states that it applies when bishops, through negligence committed or through omission facilitated acts that have caused grave harm to others, either to physical persons or to the community as a whole, that this norm would apply. The harm may be physical, moral, spiritual, or through the use of patrimony. And in the case of abuse of minors and vulnerable adults, it says that in order for a removal of ecclesiastical office, it does not just have to be grave reasons, but it's enough that the lack of diligence is just grave. The norms were soon followed by an apostolic letter, Vocestis Lux Mundi, which was published in February 2019 after the special summit that Pope Francis had organized. A summit convoked also because of the failure of bishops to react responsibly. The document was somewhat more specific in calling for reporting and disciplining of church leaders who by actions or omissions intended to interfere with or avoid civil investigations or canonical investigations, whether administrative or penal, against the cleric or religious accused of sexual abuse of minors. As Professor John Beale, my colleague from the Catholic University of America in Washington, D.C., has pointed out, the apostolic letter focused on the intention of the actions or omission that thwarted investigations will make it difficult to hold church authorities accountable for the handling of complaints that clerics and religious under their authority sexually abused vulnerable persons. The absence, so John Beale, of clear standards of performance and almost total lack of canonical jurisprudence on what constitutes culpable negligence and very grave lack of diligence will make it difficult, if not impossible, to determine whether a bishop's handling of a complaint constituted negligence, mistaken judgment, or an exercise of discretion impervious to critical scrutiny. After Processis Lux Mundi, we had a change with regard to the pontifical secret. I won't go into that because I'm also looking at the clock. And then in 2020, we had a handbook, the Father Mecum, in which I would say some of the issues were again updated and improved, certainly for the victims. In 2021, we saw the publication and or actually in canon law, we would say the promulgation of Book 6 of the Code of Canon Law. It has taken more than 12 years to produce this one book. Maybe remarkable is there is now a title in the book, and it says a violation of the dignity and freedom of a person, and it's under this new title that the canon on sexual abuse of minors is placed. The question will be, I think this is an extremely interesting hermeneutical question for lawyers. What does it mean that only the title has the change of a violation to the dignity of a person? And how will canon lawyers use that in the interpretation of the canon? Because it's not part of the law itself. The new book on penal law has less discretionary power of ordinaries, so there possibility to say, well, we'll go slowly by this is less possible. Grooming is introduced, and the delict is extended to lay members of religious institutes as well as to lay persons who have a dignity or hold an office or function. Regretfully, although in an earlier draft there were some provisions, but regretfully Book 6 was only refused. There has been no adaptation yet to the procedures. As I mentioned before, the Pontifical Commission for the Protection of Minors was established. I've been a member since 2018, and I'm at the moment chairing the subcommission on canonical norms and rules. The Pontifical Commission so far has in many respects focused on listening to victims, further education, and I think that in our whole system of the Church, we at times pay too little attention to the legal aspects. I was at a meeting of representatives of 20 Episcopal conferences of Eastern Europe, and there too there was a lot of attention. We have to listen to the victims, we have to accompany them. I personally believe there is no healing within the church if there is no justice, and justice requires proper canonical procedures. And I think that there is still a lot of work to be done on that score. So the Pontifical Commission, this working group on guidelines and norms, organized a meeting in 2019 with the title Promoting and Protecting the Dignity of Persons in Allegations of Abuse of Minors, Balancing Confidentiality, Transparency and Accountability. One outcome of that meeting was a need to attend more to the rights of victims in the different canonical penal procedures, and that has been taken as a subject for a conference we had last December in Rome with a participation of more than, of almost I think 60 people. The 2019 seminar addressed the two major topics, the seal of confession and issues related to procedures. I will not speak here about the seal of confession. But with regard to the procedures, it was clear that there is a need for more transparency in the different stages of different kinds of penal procedures, and this affects victims and survivors, it affects the accused, and it affects the community at large. Maybe a few aspects, also in combination with what we learned in our meeting last December. A right to truth. There is a right of truth that we should maybe implement, not maybe, but that we should implement in our church. It's a right of truth, both for the individual and for the collective. And with regard to the collective, we would understand this to mean also those who belong to the individual and the society as a whole. Related to this is a right to information. Information about the different stages of the procedure, for example. Information about those who are involved. Who are the judges? Who is the promoter of justice? Who are the advocates in this case? A right of information with regard to the allegation. Does the victim have a right to know what the priest is ultimately accused of? The right to information of the proofs that have been presented. The right to information to have knowledge about the outcome of the case. The rights to know jurisprudence. So far, the jurisprudence in these cases is not published. I think that this is a serious problem because if we don't know how the jurisprudence is, we do not know, and we do not know exactly how we can trust then the system. But more, or also important is if I would be the advocate, or would be a judge at a lower level court, but certainly if I would be the advocate for an accused as well, and I would not know what jurisprudence is, how can I well defend that person? Just to give a simple example, many accused are also taking alcohol as they abuse children. So how is the use of alcohol, for example, considered in the jurisprudence when a judgment is made? I think the church will have to find a way to provide for the publication of the jurisprudence, while of course preserving confidentiality, in particular with regard to the victims, and preserving the right of defense also of one's own reputation. Yet information also about the outcome will instill trust in the community that justice is being administered. The community needs to understand the decisions taken. It seems to be a decisive element in trust building and preserving trust. It also has an effect on preventive measures. Leadership cannot do without rebuilding trust. The right to truth is closely related to the right to justice. This requires a proper investigation and sanctioning. These two aspects are part of the victim's right to an effective remedy. It stipulates, however, the need to qualitative high procedures. This all depends on the training that the people have. And this also came to the fore in the two sessions we had in 2019 and 2021. What actually is the training that the people have who work in the church on these cases? the canon lawyers in the tribunals, they have studied at some point, like I did, canon law in a canon law school or program. But I think that that is totally insufficient. How do we actually, in many legal schools, many law schools, you learn maybe jurisprudence, maybe you learn the law, of course, but you don't learn how to collect the data. You don't learn how to hear an accused. You don't learn how to hear a victim, how to evaluate the proofs, and in particular, how do you handle contradictions, how to read and evaluate reports from forensic experts. The knowledge of the jurisprudence, so there we go back to the publication. Do we have access to this? Hence, there is a tremendous need for specialized training of judges, of advocates, promoters of justice. And the question, I had a conversation with somebody at the Congregation for Catholic Education, is who can actually provide this? Which Catholic university in the world could set up such a program where there is an interdisciplinary learning for the canon lawyers? I think it's too simple to believe that if you know how to annul a marriage, that you can do a penal case. There is a need to see how it is that people, victim and accused, can actively participate in the process. When victims provide testimony, I think we have to become aware, much more than we do at the moment, that we provide a context that is not intimidating, that there is psychological and legal support provided by persons the victims trust, choose, and people who are competent. I think there's a need to attend to no re-victimization. We have to learn as canon lawyers how to provide for an environment that is conducive for the victims to speak. So, for example, in the civil courts, in many cases, the judges will not wear a gown, but they will be, especially when they meet with minors, they will wear ordinary clothes. Should our judges wear clerical clothes when they listen to victims? What location are they actually inviting? Are they inviting them in the same building in which the accused occurred? Do they think about church buildings, or do they consider to go somewhere else? There is a right to reparation. How do we provide for the injustice suffered? There must be a restitution of rights violated, if possible, as well as measures of rehabilitation, psychological, psychiatric, and medical treatment with professionals that the victims trust. There must be measures of satisfaction, that is, public acts of acknowledgement of responsibility, public apologies, etc., are part of full reparation. And as we are coming to a close, I think in a summary, we can see the situation has been changing over the past year. We are learning. Countries do not go at the same speed. They basically follow the same process if I look around the world, but they do not go with the same speed, and certainly they don't begin at the same time. Sexual abuse of minor indicates severe systemic problems in the church with regard to the election of clerics. We heard it before in the presentation, and the way proper power is properly exercised or not. I think we must have better programs in place to see that leadership must act responsibly, that leadership will be held accountable, but also that for that we have proper procedures, which at the moment we do not have yet. We have a system by which metropolitan bishops are responsible for suffragans, but the senior suffragan bishop is responsible for the metropolitan. So at the moment in Germany, for example, the one is investigating the other. That simply doesn't work, I think. Yet a number of issues need attention, in particular the way the current procedures are executed. And above all, I think what is needed is a change of mentality. The dignity of the human person cannot only be the subject of the penal law in the sense that this is expressed in the title of a section that lists delicts. It must be paramount in the whole legal system. That means also in the procedures. And more important, the dignity of the human person must govern the whole interaction that we have. I'd like to close by referring to the presentation of Archbishop Scicluna at our 2021 seminar in Rome. He pointed out that Vos Estis Lux Mundi says we have a duty to care, to support, and to accompany. Pope Francis, he said, keeps telling us that the style of the gospel is tenerezza, compassione, vicinanza. We should be able to apply these notions and translate them in action, and thus show compassion, tenderness, and closeness to the victims. I thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor. I don't know if you'll be able to stay on with us for another 15 minutes for the question and answer session. I know we were supposed to have a break. Perhaps people can take a break as they need, but that we will continue the question and answer session at this time. Yes.
Please.
Hi, my name is Patrick Wall. Question for Professor Vesti. Jennifer, you heard Professor Willen say that, you know, the age prescription is now 38, I believe she said, and we know that the age of survivors coming forward generally when they make the connection is generally in their 50s, which obviously is an inherent contradiction and closes the courts again. In your mind, how do we change the culture, knowing that that's the current status in 2022, and also hearing Jerry talk about, you know, enough is enough?
That's an excellent question. I was thinking about that myself as I listened. My sense is that what will move the Vatican will be if there is uproar of lay Catholics. I think that I guess I'm trying to focus my research on hoping to be able to communicate to normal lay Catholics and priests what the reality is, and it's that we should not have any statutes of limitation. I found it incredibly heartbreaking. I worked in this weekend degree program at Xavier University in Cincinnati, where I had 25 to 70-year-olds, and every single semester that I taught, I had at least one student from Cincinnati or more per semester disclosed to me that they were a victim of clergy sexual abuse as a child. I think this is, it's so widespread. So I think that the laity, we need to get more involved. And I just think solidarity with survivors is the way that we can follow Christ. And so I think we need to have an uproar, and I think we need to say, as Jerry said, and Nuala, enough is enough. We should not have any statutes of limitation. It's just, to me, it's heartbreaking because survivors just want, they want to be listened to, and they want justice. And it's just absolutely essential for their own spiritual well-being to be able to report when they are ready, and not to be forced to report earlier or to live with that injustice. Thanks for your question.
Are there any online questions that we don't see? Any more?
So happy to bring the microphone to you if you'd like. We had talked about the panelists, if they had questions also for each other in light of the presentations. So happy to take a few minutes for that.
If I may, I do have a question for you, Miriam, in the sense of you've worked with the Pontifical Commission now since 2018. And you've specifically looked at, the rights of survivors, and certainly when I speak with survivors, that's a burning issue when the case is being investigated, and oftentimes they have no communication whatsoever. They're left in the dark as to what's going on. Where do you see that reform going in your estimation, and what can we do to assist or help in that regard?
Thank you for the question. So in 2019, when we did the first round, Monsieur Cicluna gave a paper in which I already outlined the need to pay attention to the victims. And then I said together with him, well, why don't we have a further seminar on that, which we did last December. What did we do at the seminar? We said, well, why don't we first take stock of what is the canonical situation at the moment, and then we listened to somebody who gave us a presentation of what are standards in international treaties with regard to victims. And after we heard that, we moved around the world. So we have to remember that the canonical system has to interact not only with the American legal system, but with different legal systems around the world, and with different understandings also of how these processes occur. So we then looked how did these principles, how are they implemented? And we, just to give you an idea of, because we also had part of it on Zoom, so we had to respect time zones. We began in Australia, then we had the Philippines, we had India, and we had Washington, D.C. So we had 4 variations on the same team. Then we did a session on Argentina, Spain, France, and Italy, so the more Roman languages, the more Roman legal structures, and then finally Germany and Poland. Certainly, what was a big surprise to many people is that Germany has the most, with Poland, the most elaborate system for in the civil law for accompanying victims. And at the end of that session, Monsignor Cicluna gave a presentation, kind of summarizing where shall we go from here. And it was there was a general feeling in the room. By the way, in that room. Then I will tell you about the feeling in that room. It was surprising a little bit to us that so many congregations of the Roman Curia had sent people. So when we started in 2018, there was no communication whatsoever between the different departments. And now we had, I think, 49 people from the different congregations in the room for 2.5 days. And there was a general consensus, we have to do something, and we cannot wait for a new penal a revision of the book on procedures. So with Monsieur Cicluna, we are at the moment looking what could be a next step to be taken while considering the different options and possibilities. I personally think, I mean, you are in the context of the United States, but I think if I would be a victim in the Philippines, I would expect that the canonical system would not be that different from the civil law system, and that would also go for a person in Poland or in France or wherever you live. So we would have to see how can we provide for a system that does justice to the victims. But I also want to balance this a little bit because the accountability goes in different directions. We also have to see to better information for the accused, because the accused too are often left in the dark and do not know where they are. So they don't know who their judges are. They are not informed who their lawyers are when their case goes to the Holy See. So that too is not always easy, and I think we have to improve our procedures in that whole regard. Now, you mentioned earlier the statute of limitations. Yes, there are countries, it's very different around the globe. There are countries, Germany has a statute of limitation. Germany has no obligatory reporting. That's another issue. So a country like Australia has obligatory reporting and has no statute of limitation. So there, the range is very wide as well. And I think lawyers will always say we have to, with all respects, but we also have to see what does it mean Why do we have such a thing in the penal system of a statute of limitations? And what is the capacity of people with regard to memory, and how shall we go about that? So thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor, and all of the participants. We need to break at this time. I wish we could go on, but thank you very much, all of you.
Thank you.